Immediately contests the center, seizing a vital foothold and preparing to develop pieces harmoniously. Immediately confronting the center, this establishes a fundamental pawn battle that will dictate much of the ensuing strategic landscape. Securing the center while preparing to develop the kingside. Developing another knight mirrors white's intention, establishing a balanced pawn center and preparing for solid central control. Asserting central dominion, this advance contests black's pawn structure and opens diagonal lines for your bishops. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, this quiet pawn push embraces a classical positional battle. Solidifying central control, NC3 prepares development and potential queenside pressure. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, a standard response to white's assertive pawn push. Developing the bishop to G5 pins the knight, creating immediate tactical possibilities and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Solidifying the central structure, black prepares to castle, prioritizing king safety over immediate pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing queenside development, this move aims for a harmonious pawn structure and avoids immediate complications. Securing the king is paramount, allowing for bolder piece maneuvering and preparations for the central battle ahead. Preparing for a kingside attack, this bishop aims to support future pawn advances and potentially swing to the H7 square, pressuring black's castled king. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure provides a stable base for future queenside expansion and prevents white's knight from easily reaching C5. Castling secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a fundamental step in developing a robust kingside presence. Preparing to expand on the queenside, securing the knight's retreat, and potentially preparing for a future B5 pawn advance. Expanding queenside pressure aims to seize space and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. Black immediately simplifies, accepting the pawn and simplifying the central tension. Recapturing the pawn solidifies central presence and prepares for future queenside pressure. Challenging white's central control, this move aims to open lines and disrupt the pawn structure for active piece play. Striking at the center's heart, this pawn grab momentarily disrupts black's piece harmony. Black repositions the bishop to a more active square, challenging white's central pawn structure and opening avenues for counterplay. Unleashing the queen aims to exploit the weakened queenside and pressure black's central pawns. Challenging the bishop's position, black seeks to gain breathing room and potentially disrupt white's harmonious piece development, though it invites a subtle pawn structure shift. Unpinning the knight opens tactical possibilities, but the bishop's new outpost on H4 aims to exert pressure along the diagonal. Retreating the bishop to its original diagonal secures it, but relinquishes central influence and allows white greater piece mobility. A strategic redeployment, this bishop's repositioning prepares to seize the open central file. Seeking central influence, the knight boldly ventures, aiming to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses around white's monarch. Liberating the bishop's diagonal and preparing to contest the d-file opens up new attacking possibilities. Reclaiming the queen from its temporary exile consolidates material and prepares for potential central counterplay as the board opens. Fortifying the d-file with the rook is a pragmatic choice, anticipating potential pawn advances and preparing for a central pawn push. The knight embarks on an adventurous journey, eyeing the queenside and potentially disrupting white's centralized control. Reinforcing the d-file presence, white now aims for central control and potential pressure on black's king. Challenging the central pawn structure and seeking active piece play, black aims to disrupt white's queenside control. Repositioning the bishop to A2 aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential piece exchanges, while safeguarding against any immediate knight incursions. Reorganizing the knight to the D7 outpost could be more active than this passive repositioning. Unleashing central pawn tension, white aims to exploit black's slightly misplaced knight and prepare a kingside attack. Opening the central diagonals for the black queen and bishop introduces immediate tactical skirmishes. Aimed at solidifying the center and preparing potential kingside expansion, this repositioning of the queen anticipates a dynamic pawn struggle. Swapping queen simplifies, allowing black to consolidate pressure on the d-file and potentially exploit white's slightly exposed king. The structural shift from passed pawns to doubled pawns on the e-file profoundly alters white's endgame prospects. Reasserting central presence, the bishop aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and target the d-pawn. Probing for a weakness, this pawn push endeavors to restrict black's knight and potentially gain queenside space. Reorienting the knight to better square hints at a quiet maneuvering battle ahead. Securing the c-file with this rook aims to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure and prepare for queenside expansion. Exchanging the bishop simplifies, but it allows white to dominate the d-file and potentially advance pawns. Opening the g-file grants the rook excellent infiltration potential, but weakens the kingside pawn structure considerably. Opening the queenside files, black aims to reposition the knight and challenge white's rook on the d-file, disrupting their pawn structure. Initiating knight's central occupation, the knight boldly anchors itself, challenging black's pawn structure and eyeing critical squares. This maneuver eyes the d5 outpost and prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially on c4 or b4. Shattering the pawn structure opens critical lines for attack. Doubling pawns now creates a permanent weakness on the kingside, a future target for white's advantage. Asserting control over the 7th rank, this rook now targets the vulnerable queenside pawn structure. Securing the b-file opens up possibilities for the rook to challenge the open file or redeploy to the queenside. Activating the king is paramount as the game simplifies, eyeing central control and potential pawn advances. This pawn grab sacrifices piece activity for material, potentially opening lines against your king as pieces rearrange. Pressuring the 7th rank now aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the isolated knight. Reclaiming the open file with the rook sets up an immediate battle for central influence and potential counterplay. Unleashing the rook, this aggressive penetration aims to exploit black's exposed king and create immediate threats along the 7th rank. Reclaiming the piece stabilizes the material balance and aims to activate the rook. Forcing the rook to a more active square, this check aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain tempo. The black monarch bravely ventures into the fray, aiming to disrupt white's centralized battery and contest the opened files. Securing the open file after the rook sacrifice solidifies central control. Pushing the b-pawn now risks creating further weaknesses, while the white king finds a safer haven. Securing the queenside pawn structure aims to prevent black's active knight from finding a superior outpost. Restoring the pawn structure is paramount after the exchange, aiming to activate the rook behind the advancing queenside pawns. Focusing the king forward is a daring attempt to activate it in this unbalanced pawn structure, aiming to support the rooks. Striking at the center with a pawn gambit, black bravely seeks counterplay despite the exposed king. This king walk now risks exposure on the kingside, potentially becoming a target as the pawn structure crumbles. Exploiting the open file, this captures a pawn but opens up your king's defense considerably. Confronting black's pawn thrust opens the way for your rook to dominate the 7th rank and pressure the queenside. Reactivating the rook on the d-file, this initiative aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create counterplay. Unleashing the king into the fray, white actively engages the queenside pressure. Shifting the rook to the 6th rank activates it and targets white's precarious pawn structure. Strengthening the kingside pawn structure offers immediate safety from potential threats. Securing the central file offers crucial support for potential breakthroughs, aiming to exploit white's exposed king. Pushing the pawn forward begins a daring march, aiming to solidify the king's safety on the queenside. The rook now eyes the queenside, preparing to infiltrate and contest space. The king ventures forward to support the pawns and prepare for endgame activity. Shifting the rook to the king side offers a desperate attempt to create counterplay against white's advancing pawns. Ra7. White aims to exploit the open file, potentially harassing the b-pawn or preparing a queenside advance. Re-establishing the rook's potential on the open 7th rank after a pawn sacrifice. The rook ascends, preparing to contest control of the 7th rank and potentially disrupt black's defensive structure. Reconnecting the rooks to bolster the kingside defense against potential breakthroughs. Squeezing the rook onto the open 7th rank creates immediate pressure. Repositioning the rook to a more active file allows for potential harassment of white's isolated pawns and seeks counterplay. The rook's position now threatens to infiltrate black's remaining defensive structure. Circling the rook back seeks to regain control of the open files, but allows white to solidify their kingside. Reclaiming the open file is essential, aiming to pressure black's pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Repetitive king maneuvers on the queenside are yielding no positional advantage and allowing white to solidify their central presence. Shifting the king allows for potential rook activity along the 3rd rank and prepares to defend the pawn structure if necessary. Repositioning the rook to the central files is a logical regrouping for potential advances and defensive duties. Shifting the bishop to the 7th rank disrupts black's pawn structure and pressures the king's vicinity. A bold push into enemy territory, hoping to disrupt the white rook's positional dominance. Unlocking the kingside and potentially creating dangerous passed pawns. Sacrificing a pawn to open lines and activate your knight is a bold, active choice in this closed position. Exposing the king to such immediate danger after a protracted battle feels imprudent, leaving it precariously balanced. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy monarch opens a critical, albeit precarious, path towards salvation. Unleash a decisive check, aiming to shatter the black king's defensive shelter and force a winning endgame scenario. A desperate gamble to escape immediate mating threats, but it leaves the monarch critically exposed. King hunting intensifies as the monarch's sanctuary crumbles under relentless pressure. Securing the king under a rook's watchful eye is paramount, especially with the enemy pawn poised to penetrate. Shifting the bishop to f7 aims to restrict black's knight and prepare for potential pawn advances, strengthening white's central control. Sacrificing the rook offers a desperate gamble, aiming to disrupt white's suffocating central control and escape an inevitable material loss. Securing the rook on the 7th rank solidifies white's queenside pressure and forces black's king into an even more exposed position. The black king, now exposed on g8, faces immediate threats from the advanced white rook and bishop. Gaining unchallenged king dominance in the center orchestrates a swift mating attack. The knight's foray to d2 aims to disrupt white's passed pawn and offers a chance for counterplay. Targeting the pinned knight offers immediate simplification, a sound strategy when material is even.